Most credit union leaders see fraud through the lens of one institution. Today's guest sees the fraud incidents credit unions report to each other before they ever become headlines. Today's theme, how leaders can organize their credit unions to prevent fraud instead of reacting to it after the loss. Welcome to Grow Your Credit Union. I'm your host, Joshua Barclay. If you're new here, this is the place where leaders come to share knowledge and insights to help you become a better credit union professional. If you're familiar with the show, welcome back. And I know I say this a lot, but if you have a topic idea that you want me to cover, please email us at info@growyourcreditunion.com. This is your show, so please help me make it better for you. Before we begin today's show, I want to mention today's sponsor, NCU-ISAO. NCU-ISAO is a nonprofit threat intelligence community built by credit union folks for credit union folks. So when one credit union spots a fraud or cyber attack, everybody else hears about it before it reaches their door. You'll hear more about NCU-ISAO later in the show. My co-host today is a woman who rode a horse through a Dairy Queen drive-through. You probably already know who I'm talking about. Hello, Becky Reed.
Howdy, y'all.
Howdy, Becky. Becky, I was back in my old stomping ground, New York City, and I know you were just there a few weeks ago. It was good to be back, Becky. I hadn't been there since 2024, and for all those who may not know, I lived in New York City for about 11 or 12 years. So I went back, saw old friends, took the train back to my home state, which is Connecticut, and listened to a lot of music on the train ride, Becky, which brings me to something interesting. You worked at a record store from the late 80s to the mid 90s. I'm curious, is there a particular band or artist that you didn't like that was all the rage at the time and it annoyed you because you just didn't understand what the heck was the big deal about this artist?
Yeah, New Kids on the Block.
Tell me more.
Okay, so this is late 80s, right? And New Kids on the Block, and all the boy bands. This is when all the boy bands were really making a huge debut, right, in the music industry. And mostly tapes were what people bought back then because that's what you could play in your car, right? Or you had your tape player that you would your Walkman or whatever, that you would travel around with. So yes, there were CDs, but that wasn't what most people bought. And yes, albums still existed, but tapes were portable, so you could take them with you. So the racks, we would have rows and rows and rows and rows and stacks of tapes of New Kids on the Block, and it was like everybody that came in. It was just insane. And I was gravitated more towards classic rock, which certainly wasn't new at the time. And it was called classic rock back then. It was only 10 or 15 years old. So now it's really classic rock, right? But yeah, so New Kids on the, it was just so bubblegum and just, ugh.
Well, if New Kids on the Block, if anybody from New Kids on the Block is listening, I liked you a lot when I was like 4 or 5. I don't think your music has aged very well. But when I was 4 or 5, I was okay with it, I guess. Becky, are you ready to bring on today's guest? We got a cool show.
I am so ready.
You're so ready. You always are. Isn't that interesting? Today's guest is the CEO and president of NCU-ISAO, Brian Hinze. Welcome back, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's getting trickier for credit unions to come up with a budget for fraud prevention. This was an interesting little tidbit I found, Becky. LexisNexis does this study every year. It's called The True Cost of Fraud. And what they found is that for every dollar a financial institution loses to fraud, the real cost is actually $5.75. I first read that and I was like, I don't understand what that means, so let me explain. That's including the investigation hours, the recovery, the reissued cards, the legal, and, the members who leave and bring their money somewhere else. So this dollar amount I found, it keeps climbing year after year in this study. It was $4 flat in 2021. And after reading this LexisNexis data, here's what I'm wondering, Brian. When you look at what credit unions are actually allocating to fraud prevention in their budget, does that number reflect the risk they're facing, or are they coming up with that budget arbitrarily?
It's an interesting question. And let me just first disclose. I mean, it would be a little bit atypical for a credit union to really get granular with us on their exact budgets they're carrying for fraud and things like that. And it's probably living at different places, in their financials, to be fair. That said, I do still see when you're looking at that budget that it's kind of knowing where you've been and knowing where you're going. A little bit different context, though, here, in my opinion. First and foremost, I don't think you're ever going to get to one-to-one. As I see it, that seems, somewhat impossible. So you're trying to curb the norm. You want to be below the average, right? Really, it's about knowing what kind of risks you observed, what kind of fraud you saw over the last year, where specifically those were. So having the ability to dig down and track what kind of fraud you saw, what your losses were, and then try to take mitigating measures. But you also have to know the future-looking risks, right? So you have to understand the trends, the patterns, and what's expected for fraud so that you can kind of adapt to those forward-looking tactics and be prepared if you actually start to see them at your organization.
So there isn't a true science then, Brian. You'd probably be looking at what happened to your institution in the years prior. You're trying to forecast the threats that you see emerging with trends and by being a part of an institution like NCU-ISAO, would that be sort of correct?
I mean, it's certainly advantageous to be able to share information and then, be like, how is AI evolving the scams as an example? Or what are the new tactics now that tap to pay is so much more common than it was several years ago? So since the fraud isn't static, it's more dynamic. I don't know how you can have a specific static science to it. You can have more of an empirical method, though, for sure. But I think the big advantage that fraud fighters have is the ability to quantify a return on investment in theory, right? So there's an old saying on the information security side, how do you quantify cybersecurity investment, right? Well, a thwarted attack does not necessarily have a tangible cost to it. But if you block, a $99 transaction, well, that certainly adds up, and you can compare year over year as well. So I do think the good news of all that is no matter how you do it, you can actually still measure your success in dollars and cents, which is obviously beneficial to the board, to leadership, and everyone.
Becky, when you were CEO of Lone Star, how did you think about budgeting for fraud prevention? Give me your sort of methodology for this.
Well, I have to say that this goes back to data, and I've talked about this ad nauseum here, right? That we don't do a good job in our industry of really utilizing the data that we have in front of us. And one of the things that we did at Lone Star is we just looked at our fraud losses over the last 3 years and budgeted based on that, whether or not we thought it would really go up and down. I think that the challenges that we face in financial institutions today, there's a lot of data there with crypto and forward-looking and preventative things that we can put in place that just weren't available whenever I was a CEO. A lot of the risk mitigation and fraud mitigation tools that we use in financial institutions are retroactive or even retrospective as opposed to being forward-looking and preventative. That is certainly a challenge. And then, of course, when you get to the smaller credit union sizes, they can't even afford those tools. And so you just kind of basically have to lock things down to the point where members aren't having a great experience because everything is so locked down because you can't determine easily what's fraud and what isn't. One of the things we did at Lone Star is we did use our data to take a look at how much, from a budgetary perspective, what percentage of our overall expenses, our overall operating expenses were related to payments. And that includes fraud. So that would include the risk mitigation tools that we use. That would include, anything that we had from a data processing perspective, as well as people. And that was everything, from posting an ACH file to doing general ledger reconciliations to the fraud losses we had to write off, all of that. But what was astounding was that just the payments piece, which included fraud, 25% of our overall operating costs were dedicated to payments. So when Brian is talking about an ROI, if you could even reduce that number by 3%, that's a massive number.
We're almost out of this segment with time. Brian, anything you want to add before we close out?
I just would continue to stress that that is an incredible opportunity to be able to take that ROA, to take those small wins, and then really be able to measure the success on that investment. And frankly, we'll talk about this more throughout today's session or just in general in the future. Investing in technology is becoming something that's really paramount and critical in order to mitigate fraud losses because, with things like synthetic IDs and, infinite permutations of fake humans that can be generated out there, it's going to be really hard to do this to scale without some sort of technological help.
Okay, Becky, I've been doing some reading, and it's not for pleasure, okay? So let me read you one sentence from the FFIEC Information Security Booklet. Again, I'm not reading this for pleasure. And I quote, "To ensure appropriate segregation of duties, the information security officer should be independent of the IT operations staff and should not report to IT operations management." I read that less of a criticism of IT and more as a governance point. So if the same chain of command owns the system, the controls, and the assessment of those controls, it gets harder to maintain an independent challenge function. I'm a little surprised by this, Becky and Brian, because I'm no aficionado of cybersecurity fraud, but I always thought IT was supposed to own fraud and fraud prevention. So my question for you, Brian, is when fraud is treated as a narrow operational or technical issue instead of a cross-functional risk issue, what stops getting seen?
Yeah, and let me say, I appreciate you bringing up the FFIEC guidance. In my world, which is more, again, security focused, it's considered to be an issue as well, the way you cited it. And that's, that the CISO serves a risk management and control function and thus is their boss effectively oversees them, and there's this inherent conflict of interest. So to kind of reword your question, if it's all rolled under, let's say, risk, and risk oversees information security and fraud is the same, not true. But I would say that when we're talking about measurable defense and returns on investment, and honestly, the scale of fraud, Becky alluded to without breaking it out, but just payments, including fraud losses, but all the payments being 25%. That is not an insignificant number. So if you perceive a risk or a conflict of interest, I say the reward is sitting here because if you have the opportunity to roll these under each other, or you see an organization that has what I would say is a more modern infrastructure like this or more modern reporting structure, and then you were to look at it the opposite, now suddenly the fraud that's perpetuated through digital channels that overlaps with cyber, that is suddenly become a blind spot for you. So one of the examples I like to use is like fake online banking sites. Now, if you're listening to this, of course, you have to assess if this applies to your organization. For some of you, you may have it structured differently, but who owns it when a fake website pops up that's impersonating your brand, that's trying to steal member credentials, things like that? We've all gotten those SMS messages, right? Say, oh, did you spend $400 at TJ Maxx? We suspended your account. Call this number, click here, right? And then you go out to the website and it steals a bunch of personal sensitive information. In my experience, that's usually the security team is supposed to get that taken down. They're aware of these problems and et cetera, et cetera. But what happens when the account's taken over? And then there's actually compromise of member data, social engineering leads to access by criminal actors, probably on your fraud team at that point, especially when there's loss involved, things like that. If those teams aren't collaborating in subcapacity, you run the risk of a blind spot there, and then on the flip side, now all of a sudden your cyber teams who may be able to assist with non-technical fraud like mule, social engineering, elder exploitation, things like that. The opportunities are you don't know if they're there until you have those synergies. So kind of both of these things become blind spots, whereas together these teams, where it makes sense, can start to work together, implement controls, share information. I mean, if we look at the digital space like IP addresses, many of these are used to attack on the cyber side and also on the fraud side, right, as proxies or things like that. So there's definite synergy opportunity. And again, we're talking about real dollars and cents that can make a difference.
Becky, thoughts here?
Well, I think what's interesting is that initially IT was responsible for making sure that the systems at the financial institution were safe and secure. Right. So many of the attacks that we would see more than a decade ago involved attacks on the infrastructure. So people trying to infiltrate the network, whether it be bombarding it or attacking it from the outside, or in some way trying to get in on the inside, with a USB drive or something like that. Now, what is really fascinating is we have this convergence, and Brian talked about it a little bit. So fraud, meaning member fraud, right? Losses due to payments fraud really is where it usually is, that can be from account takeovers. Also, social engineering has just absolutely exploded, where the bad actor is actually the person who owns the account, which is fascinating. That requires something completely different. So what we're dealing with today, I don't think it is an IT issue. And what we dealt with 20 years ago was not a risk issue that much. It was more of a technology issue, right? So your IT people were kind of like your firefighters on the front lines, whereas your risk people were inside looking at processes and procedures and dual controls and different things like that from an internal perspective. Well, now, who is responsible for, this is what Brian said, who's responsible for an account takeover? Is that IT? I don't think it is. Is it risk? Perhaps, but it can also be folks like ops and marketing and member services and retail. And so it involves the entire organization. And what we're seeing is this convergence and this actual merging of the CISO and the chief risk officer. And those two were not necessarily connected before. They were siloed. Their paths did not cross. Now they do. So it's kind of an interesting evolution of what's going on.
Becky, you mentioned something really interesting about the merging of roles or the evolution or the reimagining of roles and accountability and ownership. Brian, is that a conversation you've had with a lot of credit unions? Meaning, are we having to rethink roles and responsibilities to sort of keep up with, as Becky mentioned, these new threats?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the modern structure. I do. And she's articulated just that. In fact, it was something that seemed obvious when we started our organization 10 years ago. And so for those that maybe are listening that haven't actually joined the organization, but you've heard our kind of member benefits overview, because I say it in one of the first slides, that if there's nothing else you take away from our member benefits overview, is that when we look at credit union risk and resilience challenges, is that there is a convergence between cyber and fraud. And at a minimum, your internal teams, external opportunities aside, need to be collaborating and communicating. I just find it to be paramount. And I'm actually wondering, Becky, what you think as, part of a smaller credit union, but being around a lot of credit unions, I actually feel like due to agility and the ability to roll more departments under one leader, do you feel like smaller credit unions might actually have a little bit of an advantage in this case, and at least implementing this and rolling it out?
I do. And that's one of the things I talk about quite often, that speed right now, I think, is paramount and is more important in some cases to scale. And I think that smaller institutions, when you don't have these responsibilities that are siloed and these communication channels that might be fragmented, you have one person. And it probably is the COO or the CFO or somebody like that. They don't even have risk or IT in their title at all, but they are seeing everything from one particular pane of glass, and they're able to execute and act upon the information much faster because they just have broader insight across the entire organization.
Hey everybody, Grow Your Credit Union will be live on stage at CU Intersect 2026. If you're interested in learning more about CU Intersect, head over to cuintersect.com. If you're a vendor and you want to be a part of what I think is probably the premier cybersecurity and IT conference for all of the credit union world, we're giving you an offer to sponsor and join us live on stage at CU Intersect. So if you want to learn about how you can sponsor and be with us on stage, go to info@growyourcreditunion.com. I'd love to have you on stage with me. The Fed surveyed 400 financial institutions for its risk officer report, and that's a quarter of them A quarter of them were credit unions. The Fed reported that half of the institutions in that survey said they only find mule activity after the losses have already happened. And here's the part that explains why those accounts get opened at a branch teller line, let's say, and then they get caught over in the check channel. So the fraud comes in one door, gets spotted at a completely different one, and the people watching those two doors don't talk to each other. My read on this, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, is that credit unions are missing fraud because the data lives in disconnected controls instead of one strategy. Brian, what has to change for a credit union to turn scattered fraud data into one strategy instead of like a set of disconnected controls?
I mean, I think that's really been the recurring theme here, and it's the interdepartmental, interdisciplinary collaboration, right? Because the Fed finding is really about the handoff. Like they're identifying that there's a mule account, they're identifying that there's a check problem. It's just, maybe the full workflow isn't mapped. So I think it's a couple things. It's external understanding of what the real fraud patterns and risk look like in combination with that collaboration, where some people are only seeing a part of the picture and then being able to help each other understand what the full workflow looks like. And then of course measuring that. When I talk about the external piece, we've actually done some really interesting things with AI in mapping large amounts of data across illicit communities, as we refer to them. The dark web, it conjures up ideas, but we're really talking about all those places, open web, social media, otherwise, that fraudsters collaborate ultimately to work to defraud credit unions and their members. And in mapping the ecosystem, it's been really interesting to see that depending on the financial levels of interest, as fraudsters can really enter at multiple stages in the game here. So it does start with things like phishing and social engineering, but there's ready-made, compromised account takeovers that already have alternate email IDs and alternate phone numbers that you can just acquire, and you can enter right there at the stage of cash out if that's what you like. So you have to understand that this is what they're talking about and where these different parts of the ecosystem are mapped in combination with what you're observing in the branch, and then, bringing those departments together. So to use probably an overused term, a holistic approach, I don't see how it can be done any other way, especially again, as I talked about earlier on with adaptation of new technologies like tap to pay, a tactic they call ghost tapping, or abusing modern text-to-speech that's just built into a web browser automatically to try to use that as deepfake attacks with scripts and things like that. You have to know that these are things coming down the pike, and all of this to work to bring together those disparate processes, make a more cohesive approach.
You mentioned that holistic approach, Brian, and Becky, I want to kind of put that on you because you're talking to a lot of credit union leaders. You were a credit union CEO. Do you see credit unions thinking right now about how they can approach this holistically? Meaning you've got that scattered fraud data. Is there a way that you see right now where credit unions can kind of unify that and basically be able to turn scattered fraud data into one holistic system? Because it sounds to me like these different departments, these different teams, they're not communicating with each other properly, and hence you get fraud.
Honestly, what Brian was talking about, the bad guys are using AI to do all of these things, right? And for a financial institution that has been using fragmented software that is personified in fragmented organizational pieces inside the credit union, it can seem overwhelming, right? When you look at all this, you're like, how in the world am I going to, when you have somebody who's been paid to open an account and they hand that account information to somebody as they walk out the door and get paid $10 for it, and then they sleep in your financial institution until they get activated whenever somebody buys that on the dark web, inside the credit union, you're like, how in the heck am I even going to be able to find this? Well, it all comes back to data, right? And all those things that Brian just mentioned are very structured pieces of information that AI is a genius at being able to decipher and notice trends about. And so implementing AI, I think, to fight AI, certainly, but the behaviors of all of these different kinds of fraud, whether it be account takeover, whether it be a mule account, whether it be a scam, a romance scam, there are very specific and similar patterns of transactional behavior that are identifiable that a human holistically would maybe wouldn't see, but an AI will. And so if an AI can take a look at all of your transaction history, let's say it sweeps your transaction history every hour or even if it does it once a day, it's better than what we have now a lot of times, right? And it looks at everything and it pops out 10 anomalous behaviors that it wants a human to take a look at and make a decision about. That functionality is available today. It's just implementing it into your institution. And so with organizations like Brian's organization that can go, look, here's a tool that we vetted, right? There's things out there called OSINT. I don't know. Most credit unions have never heard of this, right? It's open source intelligence that's available out there that basically says, guess what? This email address has been used to open 50 accounts last week. So an AI can query it, right? It can query it and go, oh, this account just got opened and it's using an email that I just got off of the OSINT website. So there's all these things that we can do in this capability that we have to look at things holistically and not be siloed and fragmented. And that makes me actually really excited about the future. And so I'm very bullish on the functionalities that we're going to be able to introduce to stop some of these things in the very near future.
The other thing that some people might not be aware of is that the MITRE Fight Fraud Framework, also known as F3, was recently released. It's still incomplete on the countermeasures side. They're working on that. It's a collaboration of some large banks, another very popular financial services sharing association, and some other collaborators to essentially map the fraud tactics that are being leveraged to get into accounts, perpetuate fraud, account takeover, things like that. One thing that kind of dually proves my point, I guess, about not just the intersection of fraud and mapping their tactics, but that the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is more traditionally associated with tracking cyber threats, is actually some of these specific fraud tactics mapped directly in codes to MITRE ATT&CK, meaning they're implied to be also cyber. So things like phishing, as an example, MFA interception, some of those other tactics. So now you've got a well-known, well-established framework from your security teams that many of them may be using, not all of them, but many, that's mapping over to a new framework dedicated to fraud. Now, you will, in this case, have to map your various tactics over to something else until their countermeasures are there. But what's exciting about this and why I wanted to bring it up was not just to create awareness to a true framework for fraud fighters here, but also we can actually track those tactics and tell you what happens the most. So in looking at our gathering of data, I can tell you that in this case, impersonate official, which is tying back to call center impersonation, over the last 30 days of our data is your number one. So call center impersonation is spiking. If we see that over 30 days drop to number 5 or 6, we know that maybe that's not where the fraudsters are currently pointing their battleship aggregately. Phishing for information's 2, account takeover 3, phone number spoofing, which ties back to impersonate official, number 4, MFA interception, transfer of funds, which is your cash out, and then convert to crypto, which is sort of a final chain of cash out as well. Those are the 7 top ones we're seeing in fight fraud. So just worth knowing that the exciting piece that Becky's talking about of, better understanding our data and better being able to leverage it to know where to point our battleship and mitigate fraud. It's a very exciting time on multiple fronts.
Looking at this final segment, Brian, I want to pull together the theme of today because we kind of talked about a lot of challenges. We talked about some solutions. But one of the things that I want to bring to the table is how does NCU-ISAO help credit unions with some of the things we've talked about today, or just in general, really?
A lot of different ways. We've built an entire kind of dedicated fraud stack. And for those that do have fraud fighters that either have a direct role or stake in information security or have an interest in it and just want to stay informed, we offer unlimited participants in our meetings and groups. So you can, participate on the cyber side if you want. But on the fraud side, we have fraud intelligence collections. We have open source news reporting through our daily advisory report, which has a dedicated fraud and scam section just to kind of keep on what the news reports are and all that kind of good stuff, among many other things. We also just launched a weekly fraud threats report. It started coming out on Monday afternoons to everyone that's subscribed to our fraud intelligence distributions. And it's really focused on our member-to-member discussions, member shares, as well as all those illicit communities. So if you're scratching your head, what is NCU-ISAO doing with that data Brian talked about, or where do I get that data? That's where it lives. And we're actually about to launch a complementary cyber threat version that's more focused on data breach activity, defacements, DDoS attacks, all that stuff, if that means anything to those that are listening. So it is about collecting and doing something with the information, but probably more importantly, it's we don't know what we don't know. And while we work really hard to get a broader view into fraud, it is absolutely an opportunity for our members to connect with each other and collaborate. So we have a dedicated social media community in our private Slack channel for members only. We have monthly member fraud meetings. We have a fraud sharing listserv. So a number of ways to engage and tell each other what's happening, but more importantly, if you're not sure what to do about it, what you can do about it. With that and cross-functional roles like physical security, we have visibility into ATM attacks, which thankfully, knocking on wood here, has slowed down considerably compared to recent years. But I mean, cash outs, jackpotting and skimming were brutal for a couple of years there. And that kind of insight and that cross-departmental collaboration and visibility into different types of threat was really, really useful too. Before you come to NCU-ISAO, I would say at a minimum, especially if it's not in your budget at the moment, start getting those internal teams to collaborate with each other, because I think that's the real immediate opportunity within your organization, and then getting that broader view and perspective, bringing that in at the next step so those teams have more information that they can leverage and take action on, as well as get advice on what they've identified as the opportunities, right? Where are the gaps? Ask other credit unions. You're probably not the first to see a certain type of fraud. But at the same time, if we're all seeing it, we're all reporting it, and we're all talking about it, everyone's going to be safer together.
Becky, Brian mentions the collaboration and the knowledge sharing. And I want to ask you about this, Becky. And we didn't line it up this way, but Becky, you've been a member of NCU-ISAO on several fronts, first with Lone Star Credit Union, now with Bank Social. Could you speak to your experience with NCU-ISAO and sort of the value you've been getting out of it over the years?
Oh, yeah. I think that the minute that we signed up at Lone Star Credit Union, we immediately got results of, hey, here's some information that we kind of found out there on the dark web that you might want to just take a look at. I mean, it wasn't anything super serious, but, it was like, oh, no one else that I had interacted with, no other vendor gave me that information. And that was something that was valuable right away. Whenever there are breaches that happen, there have been things that have happened with different core data systems and maybe a digital banking or something like that, knowing about those things quickly is something that we've certainly used as an awareness for our employees, right? Hey, this information is now out there. We're going to maybe see an uptick in seeing some of these things come through. And at Bank Social, we do embed a crypto and stocks platform, right, into a credit union's digital banking. And members who've had their account taken over do have people tell them to buy crypto, and that's that anomalous behavior we see, right? It's out of the normal behavior of somebody who just generally buys crypto for an investment or, some other thing. You can see them testing the system and seeing, what the limits thresholds are. And that's noticeable by AI and sometimes not as noticeable to people who aren't able to see everything all in one place. And so we definitely benefit both on the fintech side of the house as well and the QSO side of the house as well as on the credit union side of the house from being members. So certainly worth the effort. And it's absolutely affordable to be a member. So even a small credit union can afford it.
And I was just going to ask about that, Brian, about the pricing and the affordability, because as you know just as well as anyone, credit union sizes they vary by an insane amount, right? You could have a $10 billion institution and you could have a $10 million institution somewhere. So talk to me about how you built the pricing model for those.
Mm-hmm. Specific to credit unions, it is focused on assets. So it is scaled. So the smaller you are, the less you pay. The larger you are, the dues are still extremely affordable across the board. And, it scales cost of service to the number of participants. But all that said, you get everything, all the same benefits, regardless of your size. So Becky did mention we do a range of dark web monitoring. I won't bog everyone down in what that looks like, but you can find out more on our website at ncu-isao.org/membership with that one. But yeah, I think you'll find it to be extremely affordable, and it all comes with all of the benefits that we list on our website, as well as unlimited participants. So you may be thinking here about how this can help you on the fraud side, but your risk folks, your cyber folks, your physical security folks, if those are all different people that are the same, then everyone stands to benefit from all those different types of channels that we've built.
And Brian, can I ask you how many credit unions, and maybe you don't know it off the top of your head, how many credit unions are a part of NCU-ISAO for those listening?
It's a little over 280 credit unions, probably about 20 CUSOs and a few different leagues. That is our eligibility. So leagues are eligible, CUSOs are eligible, and then credit unions, obviously, and they make up the bulk of our membership.
Wow, 280 some odd credit unions. Wow, Brian, that's really such a small number, Brian. Really,
well, we interestingly enough, it was serendipitous, if you will. We the week that we turned 10 years old, which was back in June, we hit 300 total member organizations. We're up above that now already, but it was pretty cool to hit that and, have one press release to rule them all, but truly celebrating, honestly, our anniversary as well as a big milestone in 300 plus member organizations.
And what's beautiful about that too, Brian, is the more the merrier, right? Because now you're more information sharing, the network gets bigger. So it's just getting better with each institution that's added to NCU-ISAO, right?
That's a perfect way to look at it. Obviously, it's like any other data. The more data you have, the more fidelity you have, the more accurate it is. And frankly, we get more sharing. It provides more downstream value to all the other folks that maybe aren't seeing that threat immediately. It's just win-win across the board and just helps the industry advance its cumulative resilience. So it's important whether you are a CUSO or a league or one of the many credit unions that you do participate, because you're not only helping yourself, but you're helping the entire industry, which is a huge advantage for all of us and builds that notable credit union difference on yet another front.
And if someone's listening, and I think it's kind of a no-brainer for me, but obviously I'm a little bit biased, but if someone's listening and they are interested in joining NCU-ISAO, what is sort of the best method to go about that?
Really up to them. I like to say we're not pretentious about our process. So, they can head over to our website. It's probably the most straightforward way and fill out either the contact form at ncuisao.org/contact or check out membership. And there's a link there for an application and you can directly apply and, kind of jump to the finish line. We'll immediately send you your e-sign member agreements and all that good stuff. And you fill out all the applicable information. So really up to you. Honestly, our phone number's on there if you want to call us. So if you're old school like me and still like to talk to people on the phone, we've got that as an opportunity for you too.
And we will, if you're listening, we will have all of those links in the show notes. So if you're one of those people like me that it's hard to listen to a website said aloud in terms of remembering it and acting on it, we will have those links live in the show notes of this episode. So if you are interested, you can just kind of go into the show notes, find that link, and it'll take you where you need to go. Okay, that brings us to the end of the show. Brian, this is kind of the part of the show where we ask our guests for their final thoughts and plugs, but I feel like we probably plugged you up pretty good here. So final thoughts, I think, here.
It may sound contrived or corny, but I think it's true. And that's that, this stuff isn't easy. You've got a lot of things flying at you from different angles. You may be a large credit union and maybe a small credit union, but unfortunately, fraud tends to scale as a function of your membership. So you're probably all battling a whole bunch of different things, but you're not alone. And so whether you act on some of the advice you heard here, or you want to start with hearing more from other credit unions, we've built a community for you, but also you have an opportunity internally, I'm sure, to improve on that process and start getting some quick wins against this ongoing barrage of consistent fraud across credit unions.
And Brian, if someone wants to get in touch with you personally, maybe they would like to talk to you about something you said today, or they're just kind of curious about picking your brain, how should they go about contacting you?
I guess they can always reach out through our phone number on our contact form online if it doesn't land on me, or leave a message, and then one of my folks will field that call. Otherwise, you can hit me up on LinkedIn. I don't have my LinkedIn URL website memorized, but I am out there on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to connect with other credit union stakeholders, share some notes. And, I do go to several events. I'll be at a couple America's Credit Unions events. We host, obviously, our conference. There's a number of ways to engage in person if that's your thing. And then I do speaking gigs and things like that across the country too. So whatever works with you, I'm here. I'm happy to connect and not only grow my network, but compare some notes and help anyone out that needs it.
Becky, final thoughts.
Well, I think that most everyone in credit union land and in banking as well, trying to keep up with the pace of technological advances that are happening is overwhelming, or it certainly can be. And so collaboration is our superpower. I say that all the time about credit unions. So having a partner like NCU-ISAO and Brian and the stuff that they do there can make it a little less scary. So I hope you'll get involved.
And Becky, how can someone get in touch with you?
LinkedIn, baby.
LinkedIn, baby. I love it every time. We're just going to go LinkedIn, baby, every time. I want to thank our guest, Brian Hinze. Want to thank my co-host, Becky Reed, the best co-host, I think. And I want to thank our sponsor, NCU-ISAO. Special thanks to our listeners for continuing to support and listen to another episode of Grow Your Credit Union. If you like the show, follow us on your podcast player of choice. If you want to be a guest or would like to talk about sponsorship opportunities, head to growyourcreditunion.com to learn more. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.